So, a key facet to realising this ambition will be for businesses to embrace climate science as part of their decision-making processes. So for this 45-minute session on how to build a successful net zero strategy for your business, we've got an array of expert speakers that will help sustainability and energy professionals who are starting out on their net zero journey or a bit further along try and develop low carbon roadmaps for decarbonisation for their business. So we're going to look to cover everything from audited energy estates to how measuring and monitoring will give sustainability and energy professionals better control of the decarbonisation process across all three scopes, scope 3 in particular becoming much more prominent. So from this session, we're going to be hearing from CDP and the Science-Based Targets. We're going to be hearing from Centrica, who themselves have their own net zero strategy, and JRP Solutions. The latter of those two are sponsoring this session, so many thanks to them. So first up, we are going to hear from George Richards, Director of JRP Solutions, who is on hand to provide us with some advice and solutions to some typical challenges when discussing net zero and how understanding your energy estate will drastically help with this. So I'm going to invite George onto the screen right now. A reminder then to please keep submitting your questions throughout. I'm going to put myself on mute and turn my camera off, but George, it's over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Morning, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Be here. So yeah, some typical challenges in developing a net zero strategy. These are some of the typical things we've heard said to us by very senior people. 2050 is 30 years away. Yeah, it does seem like a long way away, but it's a strategy, it's long term. And I guess a lot of Western businesses and organizations aren't used to thinking beyond sort of 5-year windows. So it's a bit of a learning curve, I guess. But nevertheless, we're mandated to achieve 2050, net zero by 2050. So we have to do it. Our key stakeholders haven't mentioned net zero yet. Well, if they haven't, they certainly will be. Whether it's your customers, your suppliers, even your employers, employees, or indeed other stakeholders such as investors, which is what made us as a business start to transition away from purely focusing on energy and carbon and broadening it out to a net zero proposal about 3 or 4 years ago at an ED event, funnily enough. That's where the conversation started to change. Why don't we simply offset our emissions and declare carbon neutrality? Well, in a word, it's not credible, is it? I think the whole point of net zero is to minimize your own emissions before even considering offsetting. But that's a conversation for another day, I guess. And the business can't afford to become net zero. Well, that's a complete misnomer, isn't it? You know, as Mark Carney said earlier this year, the net zero goal is the greatest commercial opportunity of our time. And I think the other quote that he said on Radio 4 back in November last year was that those businesses ignoring climate change won't be in business in 10 years' time. So there's a real powerful incentive to move forward. And as we see almost daily now, various pension funds, etc., and other investors are stating their position and saying that they won't invest, or they're choosing not to invest in companies that aren't at least embarking on this journey. One of the first tips I'd say is don't just focus on the tip of the iceberg. Most organisations, GHG emissions don't sit within scopes 1 and 2. They're the easy things to look at, or relatively easy things to look at. They're the things that are within your direct control. But your scope 3 emissions for some organisations can be in excess of 90% of your overall GHG impacts. So it's really important to start looking at your scope 3 and understand what those emissions are. And you don't have to try and tackle that all in one go. I think that's the important thing. It's to look at it in bite-sized chunks, but have an end goal in mind, i.e. net zero by 2050, 2040, whatever the date is for your particular organisation. Have a plan. I think it all becomes so much easier. It seems initially quite daunting when you start talking about scopes 1, scopes 2, and scopes 3. When we interact with organisations at the very beginning of that conversation, there is a sort of a process of education to help people understand what net zero actually means to them, what the definition of net zero is. And whilst it's often referred to as net zero carbon, as hopefully everyone in the room knows, it's not just about carbon, it's about greenhouse gases. But you'd be surprised how many organisations, senior management teams don't understand that. So there is a little bit of education to do there. And before we initially engage, we look at their organisation. If it's a manufacturer, we look at some of their key suppliers, for instance. We'll look at some of their competitors. We'll understand some of the specifics, things that may, the context, if you like, within which they operate. So we developed this plan, which starts with a program charter. And that's about establishing that universal understanding of what net zero is and how it applies to that particular organisation, because there is no one hat fits all solution, for sure. Agree the timelines, critical success factors, understand who your key stakeholders are, agree roles and responsibilities, agree how and when you're going to report and what you're going to report, and look at your targets. Are they going to be science-based targets? Because they should be. And Alberto is going to be talking more about those in a minute or two. Understand where you're currently at. So, in other words, do a net zero gap analysis, if you like. You've already decided where you want to get to and when. And now it's about understanding where you are today in comparison with where you want to get to. And obviously, the scopes 1, scopes 2 emissions is looking at your direct impacts, and then looking at how you're managing, for instance, your energy on site, what energy management systems are in place, or environmental management systems are in place. What's your quality of metered energy data? Is there a site energy plan? All these things need to be looked at and understood, and then to start looking at your scope 3s. Look at what are your key raw materials and ingredients? Who are your tier 1 suppliers? Where are they located? You'll also, it's not just about GHGs here. What, in looking at your scope 3 and your supply chains, you'll discover some good news stories, and you'll discover some things that from a CSR perspective could really come and bite you in the backside at any point, really. And I think what COVID-19 also, or lockdown, has certainly helped us to understand is the vulnerability of some of those supply chains. So it uncovers a whole myriad of things that organisations very much need to be aware of. So that'll get you to understand where you're currently at. And then create a business case. So you're looking for improvements within that gap analysis. So you'll find things that will mean that you can reduce consumption, you can minimize risk. So create a business case, because as I was listening to a session earlier, you've got to talk in business language. There's no point in talking about GHGs and tons of CO2, etc., because your FD isn't necessarily interested in that. They're interested in what it's going to cost me, what's the impacts on the business, is it positive or negative, and in actual fact, am I going to save any money here, and will I have a business in 10 years' time? So we look at that from all different perspectives, so that everyone can get on board. And then we go about designing an appropriate net zero roadmap. As I said, there is no one hat fits all solution here. And what we do is we look in 5-year windows, because we want to be able to focus and deal with known technologies, not things that might come along in 7 or 10 years' time. Deal with the knowns of today, do what you can with what you know today, deal with today's legislation and today's incentives, etc., and today's technologies. So we design that, and we can help organisations to implement that as well. So it's not a question of, here's a good plan, now go away and implement it, because one of the key challenges to many organisations is a lack of knowledge and resource and boots on the ground, and we can provide all of that. And as I say, make it happen. And there's an N missing from implementation before anyone spots that. I couldn't amend that in the graphic, so apologies. Obviously, where you can, use your own internal resources, because you know your business best, and we'll just help to supplement that either directly or through our partners and our net zero network of specialists. And we'll help you to look at alternative delivery mechanisms for capital projects such as EPCs, PPAs, and things of that nature, which we've done for many years, or a couple of decades now. And look at different delivery partners. And one of the most important things is to measure and verify performance using IPMVP, preferably, because that means that when you go back to your FD and he says, well, you know, this net zero thing you've been taking us on, what's that meant for us? Has it worked? What's it meant for us? What's been the impact? And where do we go from here? That's my stop clock goes. So I'm going to be very, very quickly finish this. Let me move it on. Right, thank you. Sorry, bear with me. That's the thing about setting an alarm clock. So yes, also and transparent communication with all. Okay, that's me done. 10 minutes.
Great. No, George, thank you for that. Yep, thank you for keeping the alarm into time as well. So we're rolling in to this now, which is great, and some great advice there, which hopefully we'll have time to touch on in the Q&A. In the interest of time, then, I'm going to move straight on to our next presenter. So I'm now adding to the stage the Director of Science-Based Targets at CDP. You can see him up on there now. And of course, as we've already heard today, science-based targets are critical to meeting corporate efforts for net zero. So Alberto's on the screen now. A reminder to keep the questions coming. Alberto, it is over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. So we heard now from George about how to set a net zero strategy, and I'm going to talk more about what does it mean to reach net zero and why it is important for companies to set net zero targets. As I'm introducing, my name is Alberto Carrillo. I'm Director of Science-Based Targets for CDP and part of the steering committee of the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So first of all, let me start talking about why do we need to transition towards net zero emissions at the global level. As I'm sure most of you know, the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is due to the imbalance that we currently have between the amount of greenhouse gases that our economy is generating and that we are putting in the atmosphere every year, and the amount of greenhouse gases that can be naturally removed through natural processes, and this imbalance is basically causing accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and of course it's causing that the concentration of greenhouse gases is going up, and as a result of the increase in greenhouse gas concentration, then we also have an increase in global mean surface temperature and all the climate impacts that we know are associated with this. We know we have currently about 1.1 degrees. We're at 1.1 degrees above the temperatures that we had before the Industrial Revolution. And basically for us to stop this process and to stop increasing the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we need to reach a state of net zero emissions at the global level. And so reaching net zero emissions at the planetary level means basically reaching a point in which the amount of greenhouse gases that we put in the atmosphere every year does not exceed our capacity to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And so this is basically the desired state, and that's what we need to do to prevent that temperatures continue to increase as we are experiencing today. Now, we have different goals to limit warming to 1.5 degrees or well below 2 degrees in the Paris Agreement. We know that in order to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, we need to reach net zero emissions by mid-century, by 2050 at the latest, which is the level that climate scientists have identified as a safe limit for us to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. We have already a number of countries that are committing to reach net zero emissions by mid-century, including, of course, the UK, now the EU, and more recently, Japan, South Korea, China, aiming to reach net zero emissions by 2060, and potentially we will have the US also committing to reaching net zero emissions by 2050. And so, of course, with this policy context, then we should expect a major transition in the whole economy and in the energy system across the globe. We basically should assume that there's going to be this transition, and that in 3 decades from now, all the products and services that we are currently producing to satisfy the needs of the population will have to be also produced without causing the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And that implies a massive transition from our production and consumption systems today. As I'm sure it was George or Matt mentioned, but also it represents an important business opportunity, as basically we will have the demand for net zero products and services all across the economy. And our high level economy that we have today is going to be replaced with a net zero economy over time. Now, how does this translate then for an individual company? Well, the direct translation is, of course, companies need to work towards reaching net zero emissions across the business model, across the value chain of the company. This basically means reducing emissions within the operational boundaries and within the value chain of the company as much as possible, and using science as an indicator about how much emissions need to be reduced across different emission sources. And then for those emissions that cannot be eliminated, we need to neutralize them with an equivalent amount of negative emissions. Once a company reaches this balance between the amount of carbon that they still produce that cannot be eliminated and the amount of carbon that is being removed from the atmosphere, then at that point we can say that a company has reached net zero emissions. Now, something important to mention, as Jared mentioned, it's important to consider the whole value chain, Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. And it is also important to use science as a guide for how much a company should be reducing emissions. We know that many of the sources of emissions that we currently have today have to be fully eliminated. For instance, all emissions associated with power generation need to be fully eliminated. Most of the energy-related emissions in our economy need to be phased out by 2050. But there are some sources of emissions that are more difficult to abate. For instance, some of the industrial emissions or some of the agricultural emissions. And so those emissions might be reduced at a lower rate. And there will be some emissions that cannot be eliminated. For instance, some of the non-CO2 emissions in agricultural processes, and those are the emissions that we need to counterbalance or to offset with negative emissions, right? If you look at most climate scenarios, they assume that over 90% of the emissions that we have today have to be eliminated by 2050. And then we need to scale up our ability to remove carbon from the atmosphere to deal with those emissions that cannot be eliminated. And so that's more or less the scale of the challenge. In the Science Based Targets Initiative, we are developing guidance and resources to guide basically, how companies should model their net zero targets. And by the end of next year, we're going to be able to start validating net zero targets from companies. So for those companies that want to have their net zero targets independently validated, the Science Based Targets Initiative will be able to do that. Finally, I just want to clarify something that is source of confusion for the time being, which is the difference between carbon neutrality and net zero emissions. Carbon neutrality has basically two potential interpretations. One of those interpretations is basically the interpretation that we have from the IPCC. And basically, in the interpretation from the IPCC, carbon neutrality is very similar to net zero emissions. So it implies reaching this balance between emissions and removals. The difference is that carbon neutrality focuses on CO2 emissions only, while net zero emissions focuses on all greenhouse gas emissions. But the concept is very similar, and both need to be reached. We need to start by reaching carbon neutrality, and then over time reach net zero emissions. Now, that's how the IPCC interprets these terms. This is not necessarily the same as how these terms are used in the corporate sector. In the corporate sector, carbon neutrality refers basically to the process of offsetting a company's emissions with an equivalent amount of carbon credits that can generate from avoided emission projects, emission reduction projects, or carbon sinks. And so this is what is usually used by companies to claim carbon neutrality. The difference between carbon neutrality and net zero emissions is that in the concept of net zero emissions, the idea is that companies actually reduce their emissions over time, and that they only neutralize those emissions that cannot be eliminated based on best available science. These two concepts are not incompatible. As you can see here, a company can be neutralizing their emissions, compensating their emissions as they transition towards net zero. But that doesn't take away the fact that companies need to reduce their emissions as well. And of course, compensating emissions is a great source to support emission reductions in other parts of the economy, but that doesn't take away the fact that companies need to reduce their own emissions, or otherwise we won't be able to reach net zero emissions at the planetary level. That's one final slide. For those of you interested in committing and being part of the Race to Zero and the growing movement of companies setting science-based targets and net zero targets, we invite you to look at the sciencebasedtargets.org website, where you can find our commitment letters. There's one commitment letter for companies that are interested in setting short-term targets that are consistent reaching net zero emissions by 2050. It's also possible. It's also possible for companies to commit to long-term net zero targets and to set interim targets as part of this journey. You can find different commitment models on our website, and we invite you to be part of this movement. Thank you.
Great. No, thank you, Alberto, for that. Some great insight there into the crucial role of science-based targets and the 1.5C business ambition as well. It's been very vocal in the needs for the green recovery. So next up, I'm going to welcome onto the stage James Rushen, who I hope is going to join me now. There he is, yep, Group Head of Environment for Centrica PLC, to provide some insight on how building the business case for net zero, and also including some examples from the company's own net zero target. Just for those who ask in the audience, the slides are available in the sense that this is a recorded session, so you'll be able to go back and watch the slides that way. So James, I'm going to hand over to you. If you can load up your slides and remember to put them onto the full screen mode as well, that would be great.
Thanks, Matt. So we are actually having a few difficulties up. It's not allowing me to share them. We had this in the, let me just try this, just trying something different.
Oh, there we go. That looks like that's going to work. If not, I can share my screen. What I can see now is the hop-in page, so the web app. So you'll need to switch onto the actual presentation.
Yeah, I just did that, but it's not coming through to you. I was trying, let me stop that, doing that. Sorry, it just wasn't working earlier. Let me try this. Can you see the slide now?
Yeah, that's the one. It's still in the PowerPoint format, so you'll need to click on full screen, but yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, it's going to full screen. So while that hopefully will work, good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be talking to you today. So my name is Jim Rushen, Group Head of Environment for Centrica. For those of you who don't know us, we are an international energy supply services and solutions company, working through brands such as British Gas and Centrica Business Solutions. So I'm going to whistle through this because time is tight, but I've been asked to say a few words on just sharing my experience of establishing net zero strategies within business. And I just want to land 3 key points with you and give some Centrica examples as well, just to bring it to life. So I'm going to go straight in at what I think really is the first step that needs to be undertaken. Rather prosaically, it is just about getting on top of your carbon footprint, your GHG accounts. So I can't really overemphasize the importance of it. You know, you can't manage what you don't measure. So you've got to get a good set of accounts. It enables you to prioritize your action, set your targets, track your performance, and report to your stakeholders. So for those of you who maybe at the start of the journey, I would say get on a good footing and align with a good international standards such as the GHG protocol. It'll let you get your thoughts in order in terms of operational and organizational boundaries, your scope 1, 2, and 3. Be focused on quality from the start as well. I mean, you do need good data quality, but you've got to balance effort to achieve that. We have a hierarchy of measurement and then calculation, and where we can't calculate, we estimate. Better to have a good estimate than a gap, I always say. Establish internal protocols to ensure consistency. There are some good free-to-use calculators online. I think the Qantas one is particularly useful because it helps you get the ball rolling on understanding your scope 3 GHG emissions, which can often be a difficult scope to get to grips with. And you know, as you mature, I would say do consider proprietary reporting software. It can really help in terms of capturing the data and the quality, and move toward independent assurance. We found it really helps give our stakeholders confidence in our numbers. And just by way of a sort of illustration, here are Centrica's carbon accounts laid out as a value chain. You know, a key insight here, as you can see on the right, is just the magnitude of our customers' scope 3. It's over 90% of our entire value chain. You know, therefore, customers need to be central to any net zero strategy we develop, which I'll come back to. You'll have your own unique profile within your company, but use it to prioritize your actions. So the next slide is around the steps, the process to develop your net zero strategy. These are some steps that I found useful. They might all apply to you. You may not do them in this order, but I think they're useful. So firstly, to get focused. So I talked about carbon footprinting, GHG accounts. You know, 10 years ago, we were all very concerned about how our business was going to have an impact on climate change. Today, it's as much about how climate change will impact our business, of course. And the TCFD have done a great job in progressing thinking here. So I would just do a quick call out on that. As well as carbon footprinting, seek to integrate climate matters into your enterprise risk management processes and your seeking of opportunities as well. Because with that risk and opportunity profile and your footprint, you're starting to build a data set which can enable you to build a business case. And that kind of will help you engage senior support. I think senior support is crucial. An early first step behind any good you know, net zero strategy is clear, genuine, visible support from the top. It's got to set the right tone. And also another early step is engage internal and external stakeholders. Internally, I find a huge amount of passion and some great ideas from colleagues often, but also I spend a lot of time with investors, with NGOs, we talk to government, customers, and build all this into our strategy. And collaboration is something I would really emphasize as well. So no one is going to deliver a net zero strategy on their own, regardless of whether you're a small business. Certainly if you're a large business, you're going to need to collaborate across teams, across functions. I spend a lot of my time I work in strategy, but also work with property, with fleet, with finance, with procurement. These individuals will have the plans for these areas, but importantly, they'll have the budgets for these areas. So get them on the pitch, get them to actually own their elements of your carbon reduction strategy. And once you've got this kind of coalition of colleagues and believers, you can start to develop the plan itself. And I think a point I would land here is ensure that it aligns with your commercial strategy. You know, how is your business going to evolve over time? How's it going to grow? What you're looking for really is to try and develop that case that shows that good energy management, good carbon management can underpin and help deliver your commercial strategy. And in that way, you elevate energy management and carbon management to a more strategic level, which in turn will help you get senior support. Just a word on targets to build on the other speakers' points. You know, they're incredibly important because they set the direction of travel, of course. I would say it wasn't long ago that many of us were building bottom-up targets based on BAU, business cases, BAU budgets, and asset replacement cycles, perhaps. Of course, today we know that we've got to set top-down science-based targets. We've got to understand what science tells us in terms of the depth and the pace of carbon reduction. But for smaller businesses or people at the start of this process, I would say, don't let that put you off if it seems too much. Start with bottom up if you have to, because you're going to iterate and you're going to refresh these targets because it's a fast moving area. And again, get your senior team comfortable with the fact that these will be iterative targets and you will seek to update them, hopefully strengthen them over time. And on target timelines, net zero by 2050 or sooner clearly is very, very important. I found it difficult sometimes to get senior management to think that far ahead. It's way beyond traditional planning cycles. So it's as much a value call as it is a sort of commercial or scientific one. What kind of business do you want to be? But it sets a clear intent. It's a statement of intent, but underpin it with near-term targets so that we hold management to account in the near term in line with science. And we've undertaken that kind of process. It took about 18 months to 2 years to develop our net zero strategy, which we launched about 2 years ago now, as shown on the slide here. I think just a couple of points I'd make. Once we'd launched the ambitions, as we call them, we integrated the low carbon transition into the purpose of the business. So it's really helped to start to integrate it more fully throughout the fabric of the organization. And also we've got 3 key areas to our strategy. One is to help the customer, our customers, progress toward net zero in line with Paris, going back to that magnitude of scope 3 point. We have a piece on enabling the energy system to decarbonize, which is quite sort of specific to our business, but again, it comes back to that commercial strategic relevance. And then our own footprint in emissions, of course, and our commitment to be net zero by 2050. And we are also reviewing these 2 years in. We're having a fundamental review. I was with the board on Monday reviewing them. So we're looking to refresh them all the time and strengthen them. And my final slide is on, within that, developing carbon reduction plans. So in my experience, a company's journey toward net zero will often involve 2 key elements. One is structural, one is efficiency. And the structural piece, by that I mean, how is your business going to evolve over time? How's the asset portfolio going to evolve? How's your market participation going to evolve? Your geographic footprint? We've sought to understand how that will evolve over time and the implications that it has on our carbon footprint. By doing that, you start to map out plausible pathways and also key moments in time where you can make cleaner choices become apparent. And then on efficiency, within that, how well are you running your business? How are you adopting technology, innovation, behavioral change to drive carbon out of your business? And for us, for example, we've got a commitment to electrify our road fleet by 2030. So it's a great efficiency drive within the business. And the graph on the right is Centrica data. Each area is either a business within our portfolio or a major asset. Over the last 10 years, we've reduced the carbon footprint by about 85%, both through structural and efficiency drives, 60% through efficiency, generally using products and solutions that we offer our customers, everything from solar to LED to demand side response, etc. And then we've mapped that going forward. How do we think the portfolio will evolve? What efficiency do we think we can bring to bear? Some areas will just peter out because we'll close assets or replace them with cleaner assets. Some just gradually pinch out as we drive efficiency within the business. And then, of course, in the sort of mid-40s, we expect to have a residual of hard-to-treat emissions. And we're already thinking today about how to invest in natural-based solutions to actually recover those residual emissions, so neutralize them. So hopefully there's a few ideas there for those sort of embarking upon their journey to develop their strategy, and happy to take questions. Thank you. You might be on mute, Matt.
There you go. My own there's some background noise coming from Alberta there. Oh. That sounds better. Alberto, if I can just ask you to unmute yourself now, if possible. So we're going to extend this a little bit. We were meant to finish at 12, but I think because we want to get through some questions, we'll add kind of 5 or 10 minutes to this, and have James, Alberto, and George answer some questions, both from the audience and from a couple of pre-selected ones as well. Just to follow up on that poll, by the way, that we started at the start, we asked the audience where they are on their net zero carbon journey. 36%, which was the most popular answer, they set the net zero target but don't yet have a roadmap, which is promising. And then 26% are actively thinking about setting one, and 24% have one and have a clear roadmap in place. 5% are already net zero carbon. So, you know, if you want to make yourself available in the chat, please do so. So we'd love to hear it. Alberto has seemed to drop off. I'll just re-add him. So to start with, one of the moment. That's great. Hopefully Alberto can deal with that while we go on with the questions. One of the questions, and it was actually aimed at George, but I'm sure James and Alberto can possibly answer it as well, which is to support net zero. What are your thoughts on the current mechanisms to do so, namely through the use of ISO standards, ISO 5001, ISO 1401, and obviously the PAS 2060 carbon neutrality aspect as well. Obviously, we heard from Rishi Sunak today that TCFD is going to become a mandatory requirement in 2023 onwards as well. How are those kind of tools well equipped to help businesses on their net zero strategy? George, perhaps if we start with you on that one.
Yeah, I mean, they all have a role to play. I mean, historically, you know, we operated around energy and carbon, and we've always been advocates of ISO 50001. And even though we're an SME business ourselves, we have ISO 50001 because we think it's important. It gives you the structure and the framework and the legacy, because one of the things that's happened around energy in particular, but the same will be true of net zero, is you need to have that responsibility for achieving it across an organization. It can't lie with one team or one individual, which historically it often has, particularly around energy, but other things as well. So the standards are there to ensure that there is a framework and there's a legacy. So, you know, the old red bus syndrome, or if people move on, that these systems are still there, and therefore you'll get that continual focus that you need to deliver net zero.
Great. And James, did you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I also agree that I think standards have a key role to play. We've been using ISO 14001 for well over a decade, as many organisations have. We use 14001 to structure our environmental management systems across all our businesses. We have independent certification across the majority of our business as well. So, but I would say, you know, you don't need to go for certification, of course. These are just good standards which give you an excellent framework to get your thoughts in order in terms of accountabilities, controls you need to put in place, identification of risks and impacts, etc. So I'm a keen supporter of them. Also, you mentioned TCFD. I think as new standards evolve, it is always worth just trying to understand how applicable is it to your business, because there's a plethora out there. And you can almost drown them a bit. But I think there are some which are unifying. And TCFD, I think, is one where it applies to all businesses, frankly. And I think we should all be seeking to adopt it. We committed to comply fully by 2022. And I think it's really helping drive carbon literacy, climate understanding within the business.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And Alberto, I'd like to bring you on this question. We've had a question from Comward. It's a really kind of big one. So George and James, if you did want to contribute, do just raise your hand as well. But basically, how does net zero, in your opinion, Alberto, impact business growth? What you know, as businesses try to minimise their environmental impacts, how does business growth change the result? In your opinion, and the organisations that you've worked with, what's your experience on this? You're still on mute at the moment, Alberto. Still can't quite hear you. Okay, well, as Alberto, just yeah, James, you want to come in on that, and we'll get Alberto.
Yeah, well, give Alberto a bit of space. So, I mean, I think, put simply, within Centrica, we don't think the two are mutually exclusive. you know, we actually think that having a strong and credible position on net zero and can demonstrate that we're taking both ourselves there and our customers there can actually underpin growth. So if the question is kind of how do you balance the cost or the commercial impact of having to do this, I think it can absolutely be a positive driver of growth. It's the way that we think it's going when we talk to our customers, our investors, government ministers that are responsible for putting policy in place that will drive this. It is all moving this way. So look for that sweet spot.
Great. And Alberto, I open that question. Do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I hope you can hear me well. So, I mean, what we see, for instance, from data that is disclosed through CDP, is that companies disclose normally a net benefit of emission reduction activities of around 17 euros per ton of CO2. That's what we got in the data that we collected last year. So most companies disclose net benefits. Sorry. But I think also, as James was saying, we need to consider how the landscape is changing and expectations are changing. Policy is going to change. Expectations from investors are going to change. Expectations from consumers are going to change. So it's also a way to adjust to an evolving reality.
Great stuff. Right. And it's also a follow-up question for you, Alberto, as well, from Golnaz Ignati. And it's basically for an organisation that sets a science-based target, but doesn't necessarily achieve it in the time frame. What kind of I suppose what kind of support can they receive from your organisation to stay on that decarbonisation path? And also, how should they approach communicating the fact that perhaps they didn't get as far along the decarbonisation trajectory as what climate science requires?
Well, we have some flexibility in the SBTi around this because the reality is no organization has ever achieved net zero emissions yet, right? Our economy is not there yet, and I think it's a collective challenge that we have, and we need to find a way to get there and to get the technology in place, get the policy in place, get the finance in place to get there. So I don't think this is about the implications of not achieving it. I think it's about finding the way to achieve it. As SBTi, what we encourage companies to do is to report progress on their targets, and to review their targets as they go through the journey, because they will certainly find changes in their business, in the boundaries of the company, in the external environment, and yeah, I think it's just a good practice for companies to review their targets and then to disclose progress. And I think we all need to understand that it's a challenge that no one knows exactly how to address, but that we all need to address.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to jump in on that at all? Or I can go on to the next question if not.
I think just from the business perspective, it's good to hear Alberto talk really about sort of pragmatism. I think we all need to be very pragmatic in how we progress on this journey. So we expect in some years we won't reduce our carbon footprint. In some years it may even go up, but we are going to explain that very transparently as to why it did and how we square that with the carbon budget approach in terms of overall we're making the reductions we need to against science. And I think if we can have pragmatism from organizations such as the SBTi, and companies are very transparent in how they progress on their journey, then I think collectively that's the right approach.
Okay, George, do you want to jump in on that as well?
No, I agree. Transparency is absolutely critical for organisations. I don't think anyone's expecting silver bullet solutions or companies to become net zero overnight. It's at this point in time, I think, for those companies declaring they're on a journey, I think is good. But to have a good, tangible plan to get you there is really important, and then to obviously report regularly and transparently to all stakeholders how they're progressing on that journey. And there will be some, there will be some backward steps, I'm sure, along the way. I mean, one of the things that we're being asked quite a lot at the moment is to do options appraisals and feasibility studies around on-site generation. So one of the first questions we always ask, as we do for standards such as ISO 50001, is what are your drivers? You know, what is it that's critical to you? Because if it's the spark gap is obviously helping to drive some of that interest, if you like. But the first question we'll ask is, yeah, fine. In the short term, that looks attractive from a financial perspective, but how do you square that away against your net zero ambitions, if indeed you have any net zero ambitions? And if you don't, that's another conversation we need to be having. So it's interesting.
And final question, then I'll get all three of our panelists to answer this. It's a word that's cropped up a lot in the chat for this session, which is offsets and offsetting, the role that plays in net zero strategy. And I mean, we've seen some really high profile business strategies like from Microsoft pledging to tap their historical emissions, and that kind of goes beyond offsetting with carbon removal. But I think for a lot of businesses that don't have the scope and the finances at Microsoft, offsetting is a crucial role. But there's also perhaps some cases where people are overtly relying on offsetting over actual carbon reduction strategies. So the question to finish on today is, where do offsets sit in a net zero strategy, and do they have a time limit before businesses should actually be going, actually, we don't need to rely on offsets anymore? So James, if I start with you on that one.
Yeah, I mean, my initial comment would be one, and I'm sure many people will say it today, is offsetting is a precision tool that should be used only at the right time. I think you've got to put all your efforts into aligning your organization's strategy with net zero and reducing your emissions, proper reduction on the journey. Offsetting can be used, but interestingly, you know, we've got a policy not to use offsetting within our organization currently. We don't do it, and we do, however, provide, say, some green tariffs, like a gas green tariff, which needs to have some kind of offsetting element. But we're moving away from offsets toward recovery and capture, natural-based carbon capture. So even within the world of offsetting, what do we mean by offsets? Do we mean offsets or do we mean neutralization? I think you've got to be very clear about that. But I would say it's only to be used at the right time. And for us, that's going to be at the very end of our journey, frankly.
Great. And same question to you, George.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, it's horses for courses, but in general terms, I'd agree with what James just said. Yeah, a lot of organizations will have residual emissions probably throughout their journey, and maybe even at the end, and to get them over the line to achieve that net zero position, there may be a need for offsetting those residual emissions that remain. However, I'm hoping that technology will catch up and enable the vast majority of organisations not to be in that position, and therefore not to have a need. But we are working with and have worked with a number of organisations to help them offset residual emissions. And when that is a desire, for whatever reason, to do that at this early stage, it's got to be credible. It's got to be done through a credible scheme. We work closely with people like the Gold Standard, Woodlands Trust, people like that. And so we've done options for organisations that want to go down that road. But we won't do it as a single interaction. We'll do it as part of the net zero journey. So we won't just help an organisation offset. That's not what we're about.
Good to hear. And Alberto, your thoughts to finish on.
Well, I think pretty much in line with what James and George already mentioned. I would say one additional thought, which is the Paris Agreement has 3 pillars. One of them is mitigation. The other 2 are finance and adaptation. And I think companies can play an important role across the 3 pillars. And offsetting is a way in which companies can contribute to finance. And I think companies should see that as an opportunity to contribute to another pillar of the Paris Agreement. But still, we need to reduce emissions, right? And I think the priority for mitigation, from a mitigation point of view, should be on reducing emissions. But then offsetting is a perfectly viable vehicle to finance and contribute to the huge climate finance gap that we have.
Yeah, definitely. The hard yards are ahead, but it's good to see the optimism both from our panelists and in the virtual chat room, I suppose, as well. And we are out of time for this session, so thanks 3 of you for agreeing to overrun slightly to answer the questions. And yeah, in the chat, if you join me in thanking James, George, Alberto, and of course Centrica and JRP Solutions for this session. We're going to head into